All right, Jeremy, thank you for being here. I don't like doing long winded formal intros of guests, so if you'd be willing to just do a quick and dirty rundown of who you are and what you do in business, that'd be amazing.
So currently, I am the chief growth officer for we're approaching our Series A prop tech and fintech startup, and I'm the growth hacking coach for Client Ascension, a community of something like 300, 350 marketing agency owners, and I have my hands in a few other startup ventures as either a consultant or on the board or as an advisor, and have something like a decade of scars in startups at this point.
To kind of start meta, I'm curious to know what your why for getting into entrepreneurship in the first place was.
I was dragged kicking and screaming.
Mm,
um, so as many people do when they're beginning their career, I didn't really have any sense of what I wanted to be doing. And
mm,
so it was just out of necessity. That was really and I honestly don't really even know if I consider myself an entrepreneur. I'm more of the right-hand man guy.
mm,
Like I'll let them be the idea guy and then I just make the magic happen, if that makes
mm.
sense.
That makes sense. Basically, what I'm getting in terms of what your why was basically figuring out how to sustain yourself and become an
Survival,
adult.
yeah.
Yeah, survival. Do you think if money were no object, you would have ended up a jazz musician?
Probably, yeah. I probably would have, to be honest. And actually, I may still wind up going and just being a musician at some point in my life. That's not a bad retirement plan.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think about this a lot, the conflict between what we're passionate about and what we would like to dedicate our life to, and then what our society and capitalism demands that we turn our life into, and trying to integrate those two in an authentic way is quite challenging.
Yeah, I mean, authenticity. You can't eat authenticity, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the long and short of it, right? At the end of the day, you have to pay your bills.
Yeah.
So, and the stats don't really lie. The
Yeah.
vast majority of startups don't work. They go bankrupt, they go under, they do not make it to the 3 year mark. I
Mm.
think it's something like 90%. So, if you want to quit your job that is paying your bills, you have no savings, and you've got plenty of opportunity for career advancement. You've got your health insurance covered if you're in the U.S., which God knows that's important, and you're going to throw that away for a 1 in 10 shot of success on average. I'd say that's a pretty foolish decision most of the time if we're being statisticians. Now, if
Yeah.
we're being romantics or guys that fly more by the seat of their pants, the more instinctual kind of people, they'll say, "Well, okay, you have to chase your dreams because on your deathbed, you're always going to wonder like, what if I had gone for it." What I
Yeah.
would say to that is, if you're on your deathbed because you're starving because you gave up your job, you'll probably also wonder why you did what you did. So
Mm.
like, and I'm not saying like if you quit your job and go try and be an entrepreneur that just de facto you're gonna go starve. Like there's great social safety nets in many countries in the world and here as well. But that's still the facts. So what Elon has said and what many other entrepreneurs I know have said is if you cannot live without becoming an entrepreneur and doing your own thing, like great, fine, do it. Because like nothing I tell you is going to sway you anyways. So fine, whatever. But if I tell you don't go be an entrepreneur and you listen to me, it means you didn't want it badly enough to make it work anyways. So I'm
Mm.
going to tell everybody I meet, don't be an entrepreneur. Because if you ignore me, that means you had what it took.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. It makes me think of this concept that I recently learned by getting a chat GPT rundown of Nietzsche's philosophy.
Ah,
And I just always heard about how important this man's brain was. And so I wanted to get the summary rundown. And one of the topics that Nietzsche talks about is called endless recurrence. And it's the idea of if you look at your life and basically you get to the end of your life and then you find out that you have to relive that lifetime for eternity, would you be happy with having to groundhog day that life for eternity? And it sort of hit me as this whoa moment because it makes me analyze the way that I live my day to day and how the decisions that I make out of more of a survival based safety that kind of compromise my authenticity or maybe aren't in that more leap of faith category suddenly become, while understandable and honorable in their own right, kind of gray and undesirable to relive over and over.
I do want to
You want to jump in?
not to segue, but I just know I'm going to forget if I don't
Yeah, yeah,
touch on it.
please.
So first thing I would say is ChatGPT is great for getting the like rough kind of concepts of a book
Yeah.
to see if it's worth reading the book. But if you're reading something like Nietzsche, that's just absurdly nuanced.
No, for sure.
I'd read the book, man. I'd read the book.
No, definitely.
Yeah, and on the endless recurrence thing, when I was reading that his work on that side of things, you know, when I first read it, I was like, oh, this is incredibly profound, and it is. Don't get me wrong, but then you think like, okay, well, but I'm not Groundhog Daying this 1,000 times, so at the end of the day, does it really have total absolute bearing on how I live my life this one lifetime I get, as far as we know? I don't know. That's just my take on it. Maybe that's an ignorant take or a not nuanced take on it. But
It's a fair critique, and it's interesting. There are a lot of places I could go with this again, but I'll say, hmm, yeah, screw it. I'm gonna bring this up. So there's this spiritual teacher named Bashar. Basically, his teaching is that our emotions are not just arbitrary chemical functions, that basically his perspective is that we have a soul and that our emotions are basically a guidance system to show us how in or out of alignment our given perspective is with regards to how our soul sees reality in that more kind of fundamentally true way. And so, in that context, he says that excitement is basically a compass that our soul is using to show us what direction we should take in life. And not just excitement arbitrarily, like, oh, I'm excited to feel high, so I'm going to take this drug, but like authentic, discerning excitement is what he calls the complete toolkit to basically embody the highest version of ourselves that we could possibly be. And that in following that toolkit, that guidance mechanism, that we can also show ourselves that the things that we're most passionate about have the ability to also support us in a very physical existence. So when I think about that in the context of endless recurrence, I think about how every time I'm doing something that I'm doing for the out of fear, out of the desire to be physically safe, instead of taking that more leap of faith route, I feel like I'm kind of actively missing out on what could have been a higher trajectory for myself. And so there feels like there's this constant battle with choosing whether or not I'm going to choose safety and predictability or if I'm going to choose like authenticity and expansion. Curious if you have a take on that.
yeah, well, I mean, take this with a grain of salt because I'm a physicalist.
Yeah.
Like I'm a scientist. I'm an empiricist. Physicalism is my world, not idealism, not the soul,
Mm.
not faith. I'm not a man of faith by any means in any circumstance. I doubt everything. I am a skeptic. So
Mm.
so like the concept of higher energy states and like being at odds with your soul and anything like that is just completely incompatible with every like fundamentally with my worldview.
Mm.
So take that with a grain of salt.
Sure.
But I think it's just an equation. It's like, okay, I have a 90% chance of failure at this. I have a 100% chance of security and success and stability with this. If I do this, okay, I've removed the like what if thing that I would have wondered about for the next 50 years. If I fail, can I go back through the door? Can I go back the other way? Like Jeff Bezos talks about the closed door and open door decisions.
Mm.
If you make this decision, can you go back through the door and go take the other one?
Mm.
Or is it a closed door? If you walk through it, it's closed shut behind you forever. I think the open door decisions where you've got a million, like, maybe your parents were rich or something. You'll always have security. Like, okay, fine, go try the startup, go be an entrepreneur, go do whatever your heart desires. Right? You have that luxury. And if you
Yeah.
don't take advantage of that privilege, that's almost not fair to the people who didn't have any privileges.
Sure.
So, like in that case, sure, yeah, jump, take the leap of faith, whatever. But if you are in the other position of like, okay, I don't have this safety net, I don't have parents who will support me, I don't have. If I quit this job, I have no guarantees I can go back to it. If you're working minimum wage or something, like fine, okay, quit it, whatever. Who cares? Like, there's a million minimum wage jobs as long as you have like basic competence and like can operate some buttons. Like you can go get a minimum wage job somewhere, right? But if you have a really great job, it's like, and it's not soul crushing. I mean, there's a lot of ways to find fulfillment in life that are not your job.
Mm.
I mean, if they'll let you listen to podcasts while you work, if you can find a different division within your company. I mean, sometimes it's not the company you work for; it's the role you have in it. Like in my case, right? I don't like hiring. I'm really good at it because I read people well, but I don't like hiring. And with one of the startups I was working at, they really wanted me to be hiring, and I just had to sit down with the founders, and I was like, "Look, guys, can I find you a better recruiter than me and do something else?" And they're like, "Yeah, of course, whatever." And in monolithic multinational corporations, you can't really do that. But if you're working with a smaller company, I mean, so I guess all that to say, I don't really subscribe to the whole like I'm I'm not living my authentic life and I'm like compromising my soul
Mm.
thing. But it is a risk reward thing to me. It's
Mm.
like if you are completely miserable and it's a 10% shot of having a great life, fine. If you're not miserable, why chance everything on a 10% jump? And like all the entrepreneurs will tell you, they'll be like, yeah, dude, it's the greatest thing ever. Just go be an agency owner, go start a business. Like you'll be rich and whatever. And it's like, okay, yeah, you're seeing that because they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on their social media content marketing company and their paid ads and everything to get in front of your face because they were successful. You don't see the ones that weren't. So
Mm.
I don't know. That's my take on it.
Do you think that 10% chance of success also applies to people who try to start marketing agencies, for example, just to like, maybe their goal is to make 10K a month, like the stereotype, and they want to do that through, something like I'm doing, like a lead gen agency or an email marketing company. Do you think the chances of success with that metric are equally slim?
So there's like three levels, I would say. There's like employed, there's self-employed, and then there's business owner.
Mm-hmm.
Being self-employed, I consider kind of a different category.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's even gradations between that, where you have somebody who basically just has four bosses. So they're basically employed just by four different companies.
Sure.
And that's to me like almost more stable in some ways than having like one job, because if one of your bosses fires you, you still have three others, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of a different game than like, let me quit my job and put my $100,000 in savings into like building this startup. So I mean, I think if you're leaving your job for something that's presumably going to be cash flowing, now granted, I wouldn't go start an agency with zero skills. Most of the time, that's a very long and painful road. If you can go get some skills while working your job, and get some measure of success before you quit, that's what I did, and that worked out very well for me. That's what David Riggs did. He worked his management consulting thing for like 3 years, saved up his money, and then once he had like a year of expenses and a bunch of skills, he's like, all right, cool, time to do it.
Nice. And so, for those who don't know, you also, at some point in your career trajectory, were running your own lead gen agency that was initially primarily focusing on LinkedIn. I don't know how much the scope went beyond that, but be curious to hear how you how far did you take that agency, maybe in terms of MRR, if you're comfortable sharing, and then what did you do to transition out of that?
Yeah, so January of 2022, I was still full time with the tech startup that I was working at, that we'd gotten to. I don't remember what revenue we were doing, but I there were a lot of reasons I wanted to leave. I just didn't see them really scaling or growing further, which I was wrong about, by the way. They actually are doing great. And funnily enough, I'm actually helping their new outbound department. But the um, the first month of my agency, so I didn't quit that job till I had my first couple of clients. So I quit February 1st, 2022. And my first month, I collected 22,000 in cash. And
Crazy.
then the at first it was mostly like upfront deposits, and like pay per lead. And so I had one client that was like $100 per lead, which is just defined as a positive reply from any person who's one of these job titles at a company that fits these criteria, right? So that's a quote unquote qualified lead. And that worked to a certain extent. And I had one client that was like a 5,000 a month retainer plus leads. And that was fine, but I just didn't like the cash flow of upfront, and then like until you hit this certain number of leads, it's like it comes out of the deposit. So I was like, okay, fine, we'll just do upfront, no deposit, right? And at that point, I had enough social proof that like I could close deals that had risk in them for the other party, because they knew I could get results. And that was still fine, but I didn't like the inconsistency with my revenue being tied to lead flow, that like some months, just as a function of seasonality, were going to be worse for cash flow than others. And I didn't like that.
Mm,
So, and I also knew if I was going to scale up my team, I couldn't have inconsistent revenue. Like I needed to be able
mm,
to predict how much revenue I'm going to have every month, so I know if I can pay the salaries, right?
mm.
So I switched over to a retainer model. My biggest month that year was something along the lines of 73,000 cash collected, and it was never really quite like monthly recurring revenue as it is. It was more like I currently had a certain number under contract. Some of them were short term engagements where I would set up their systems, and some of them were long term engagements. A lot of the times it was, I didn't like doing that thing where you kind of hold companies on the hook and you set up all their systems, but you don't show them how it works or give them like enough autonomy with it that they can run it without you. I didn't like that. I figured I would rather just give them all the tools they needed. If they can run it internally and like get rid of my expense, great, so be it. Because I was the guy in house managing however many different agencies, and it was like it was horrible how they would try and milk us for money. Like they would try and hold us hostage almost. So
Mm.
and in terms of like transitioning out of that, I tell most of the guys in like the lead gen or demand gen or whatever space of marketing, performance marketing, that once you get a client or two that have a great product or service, they have product market fit, and you are confident you can scale the company if you double down on it. Um, that's kind of the inflection point where you decide, do I want to scale an agency and have a bunch of clients, or do I want to have more like a growth consultant, growth partner, quote unquote, fractional chief growth officer, whatever you want to call it, kind of model where you double down on a smaller number of companies, you take equity, you take rev share, and then you make the bulk of your money on the back end from performance kickers. And if you don't,
Mm.
if you're in niches where it's really hard to drive like tangible revenue, it's hard to attribute. Like, if you're working with MSPs, it's they're lucky if they get four good leads that close a year, right? So
Mm.
if you're working in that space, it doesn't make any sense. And if you're great at systems and operations and processes, I think it makes a lot more sense to try and scale an agency that you have a lot more repeatable, like, you don't go as deep, you just go broad, and you do less for each company. So you're just kind of doing the minimum, like 20% that gets 80% of the results. It's never quite that cut and dry, but I'm not a detail like organization guy. So that just didn't make any sense to me. And so I kept I kept bringing on new clients. And some I really liked, so I kept, and some I didn't like so much and did not keep.
That's super interesting. Also, kind of, I mean, one thing that perked my ears up was, first month you said you made 22K, and then you were able to charge $5,000 retainers plus pay per lead. That's pretty unprecedented for someone, getting into lead gen. And
It's rare, yeah.
yeah, do you think you were able to charge that much because of your background and the resume you had?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. I also, I mean, to be honest, it was partly luck. I
Okay.
mean, the confluence of, so there were like three things that went well for me that just kind of all coalesced into that. And so the first was, at the time, um, the company I was working for invested something like $50,000 over 2 years with one of the world's experts on LinkedIn automation and LinkedIn outbound marketing. And so I got basically an MBA in LinkedIn outbound marketing, essentially. And at the time, LinkedIn had this delightful bug where you could scrape Sales Navigator with any one of 100 tools that were easily available if you Googled scrape LinkedIn, right? And you could take those scraped lists and format them like they're your contact list and just re-upload them to LinkedIn and say, hey, here's all my contacts. And then, I found a script that would let you auto select all 1,000 people on the list, and you'd click the button, send 1,000 connection requests, and you could rinse repeat that every week.
Wow.
And so in the span of a year, you could add 15,000 LinkedIn connections if you wanted, which is ridiculous because those are followers too. And they see your content. You can invite them to events. You can direct message 100 of them a day, and they'll convert significantly better than people in your email list. So
Wow.
there was that. There was the MBA that was basically subsidized by my company. And then I just thirdly got lucky with my first client, was a very generous, like super referrer. And she immediately introed me to like two other companies when I hadn't
Wow.
even really done all that much for her yet. Um, and so that was like, I came highly recommended to this other company, and they'd seen my results and they were like, okay, whatever. And they had a ton of money. That company's actually sold since, and made a mint, but yeah.
Wow. Okay. That makes sense. I don't want to beat this topic into the ground too hard, but I think it's one of the ones that I spend the most thought energy on. And
Yeah.
so when you watch people like Kobe Bryant, Sam Ovens, Gary Vee, kind of a strange list, but they all they all talk about basically loving the game, and that's why they're at the top of what they do. Is because they're like, why would I quit? I love it. And I even watched a video by Sam Evans where he basically says, this is like the key to success. It's the video is called "Why You Can't Do the Work," and he's basically saying like you don't love what you're doing, and so it kind of creates this idea that if you don't love running an agency, for example, then you're not going to be particularly successful at it. And yet, I watched a video yesterday by Matthew Larson, who's in Klein Ascension, and he's making like $1 million a month with his agency, and he's like, I'm doing this for money. Like, I don't
Yeah.
care. Or you watch Andrew Tate, and he's like, do you think the Chinese billionaire who runs a concrete business and like loves concrete? It's like, no. So I'm curious where you stand on that, because I think it's easy for people to get lost and be like, damn, I don't love this. I must be doing something wrong.
Well, it's called WORK, not PLAY. I do think there's a huge advantage if you can, like, I know several entrepreneurs that have very addictive personalities, and they've
Yeah.
almost hijacked their brains into using those same sort of neural pathways that they just get off on the Stripe notifications.
Yeah.
And so they turn their addiction for good. Whether that's healthy 40 years down the line when they're already a billionaire is another question. But insofar as you define success as how big your bank account is, then loving the game is absolutely a fantastic resource in your road for quote unquote success. I do think it's a little bit naive to believe that you need to love the game to be successful. To his point, like, I don't think that guy running the concrete business gives a shit about concrete. Pardon my French.
Can I ask you a quick follow up on that?
Sure.
A more precise question would be, if you don't love the game, how do you get through the inherent drudgery or tedious work that is required to build something that lasts years and cash flows well?
I think everybody has a different why. I think figuring out what yours is probably, and granted, I'm not an expert on this by any means. If you're interested in this kind of question, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Happiness Hypothesis, is kind of an interesting starting point, I suppose, for getting into that literature. But for me, I figured out that security was my biggest motivator. And so and this is not what I recommend people to do in general, but this kind of worked for me, is I overextended myself financially. And so I inherently made myself feel insecure. And I knew that unless I figured out a way to make twice as much money, I was not going to have 6 months in savings. And to this day, I still kind of do that. I over leverage myself a bit. Right now, we're saving up to upgrade and get a bigger house, but and so like that's probably the only reason I'm saving. But if I wasn't trying to do that, I might actually still be doing that. But then I know other people that it's like they're more competitive, and so the thing that works for them is they find somebody in their cohort, among their peers, whatever, who is kind of in a similar stage in their journey, and they get motivated by seeing other dudes do better than them, and they're like, oh, screw that, I can't lose to that guy. If you look at it in terms of like Big Five or like Hexaco psychometric dimensional analysis of personalities, that'd be like somebody low in agreeableness, which is common among entrepreneurs. That's going to work well for somebody high in neuroticism. Is going to lean more on the like security side of things, like myself, because I'm very neurotic. I was a pre-med after all, so.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting because I've asked this question to a few people, and it seemed everyone gives me a different answer. Yeah. And so this theme that I've been on lately is embodying your own knowing. like not needing to feel like you need to look outwardly all the time to get the answers that you're looking for, and actually allowing, I'll use I statements here, allowing myself to tap into that part of myself that almost feels like it's behind the questioning insecure mind, that's just like this rock solid sense of like, I know, I know what to do. Or if I don't know, I know that I can come to the answer myself by trying and learning by doing and iterating. And there's a much more empowering quality, I find, to embodying that energy of knowing rather than kind of seeking the perfect answer from someone outside who's going to say the thing and then everything clicks and then you're golden, you know? So,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
gurus are overrated. I do think there have been many times in my life where what somebody external to myself said did kind of make things click, but
Sure.
the only thing that like really moved things along was just lived experience and
Hmm.
trial and error and like just digging in with myself. I actually am somewhat of a proponent of therapy for some people. I know that's an unpopular opinion in the entrepreneurial like manosphere. And granted, like there's some really bad therapists, and it's not for everybody. But like I didn't realize half the pathologies that I had as like remnants of my delightful childhood, and those like unearthing those absolutely helped me in business.
For sure. Not to discount that at all with the knowing thing that I was talking about. I definitely
Yeah.
have gotten a ton from people like you and therapists as well. I honestly think therapy is for everyone, and people are just good at denying it, but everyone needs someone to talk to.
Well, that's an interesting literature because there have been some papers that have come out that looked at like lingering negative effects, pathologies, what have you, from people that go to therapy, and whether that's because the therapist was terrible or it was the wrong modality or they unearthed their demons and did not settle them yet before they
Yeah.
quit, can be debated ad nauseum. I'm not
Yeah.
I'm not qualified to take one stance or another on that, but
Yeah. Totally. I think it's safe to say that just the act of self-inquiry is good, and to have someone else to reflect that, who's, I you know ideally very skillful and knows how to help facilitate that in a way that we can't always do for ourselves, is at least good in theory. And unfortunately, some people are maybe not the most attuned at doing that.
let me play devil's advocate for a moment.
All right, let's do
Um,
it.
if you have done zero introspection and you believe that you are the second coming of the savior, you just believe you're the greatest thing that's ever existed.
Yeah.
Have done zero reflecting on how you compare to anybody else. You just only really look at, I believe this, I know I can do X, Y, Z. That person, let's say they become a huge influencer because what else is being an influencer other than like weaponized narcissism or like self-absorption, right? I think you have to be at least to a certain extent narcissistic, maybe not in the like clinical definition of that word, but more in the colloquial sense.
Mm.
To go like talk at your phone for 3 hours a day. um, but let's say he's thrilled, he's making great money, he's making tons of connections with all these other people that also believe he's the greatest thing because why would they follow him if they didn't agree with him, right? He has this wife that absolutely adores him, and and then one day he sits down with a monk who's just like, your shit doesn't stink. Your shit stinks, right? Like, you aren't a perfect, completely flawless individual, right? And he's like, oh my god, you're right. And he just starts doubting everything and loses all certainty, all stability in his psyche, right? And this is like a very played up analogy, but I
A
don't
very
think
slippery
it's.
slope, perhaps.
Yeah, but I don't, but at the same time, I don't think that is completely detached from reality. It's like implausible to happen. So, um, again, I'm not saying don't be introspective, effort, but I do think that it's not as black and white as like everybody needs to be more introspective. I think some people are too self-obsessed and too focused on like digging into themselves when they're kind of missing, they're letting life pass them by otherwise.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, I sort of feel like in that analogy, I would imagine that. I mean, first of all, the supposition of a person who's like born with a god complex, and then
There are many. It's not uncommon.
no, sure, sure.
Yeah.
But then all of the interesting pieces, like you have a total god complex and do zero self reflection, and yet you have a female partner, let's say, who just loves and adores you and never like makes you reflect on your shit. Like, if there's one thing I've learned about having a girlfriend, it's that that the vulnerability and the exposing of oneself and all of the deep nooks and crannies get exposed real quick. So I imagine that also then if someone had such a sort of fragile god complex that one person comes up to you and they're like, hey, have you considered this about yourself? And they're just like, no. It's
Well,
all over.
some people absolutely do have proclivities or inclinations towards authoritarianism, insofar as
Yeah,
they want a big, strong man who's absolutely certain of everything to tell them that everything's going to be all right, that they know what they're doing, that they know this is the right direction, and they can just follow. And they
yeah,
can relax and settle into the reality that everything's going to be okay because this person is in control.
yeah,
And that person, I think, wants somebody who has a God complex to a certain extent. Whether that's a healthy relationship in the long run, I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe the person that is completely unequivocally filled with doubts 24/7 is a great match for the person that has zero doubts about anything. Right? I don't know.
yeah. No, that's fair. Actually, my girlfriend and I were talking about that the other day, because I brought up to her that I saw a sort of red pill type video on YouTube Shorts, but it was like the the female version of red pill, where they're kind of the like women who support Andrew Tate type people,
Yeah, yeah, of
and
course.
and I thought it was, she actually made an interesting point, which was, someone asked her if they just want this ultra masculine man, and if that's an accurate depiction of women's desires, and she basically said, we want someone who we know that we can be on their ship and we can close our eyes and kind of go about our lives and enjoy ourselves and like sink into our femininity and know that when we open our eyes, we're going to be somewhere desirable, somewhere good. And we didn't have to focus on steering the ship. We could focus on maybe like making the ship beautiful and raising a family on the ship, and the man's at the helm steering them to a good place. And I thought that that was kind of profound, albeit maybe a limiting view of, or a generalizing view of what women want, because obviously it varies. But I thought, yeah, it makes sense that someone would want a man who kind of has that primal, modernized primal ability to provide and fight and make sure there's enough food on the table and all of these things. There's something very structurally and organismically settling about that. So,
Yeah. So to your point, I think painting an entire population, roughly half of the population, with the brush of we as a monolithic entity is perhaps a bit drastic,
for
but
sure. Her
but
words,
for
not
the
mine,
sake
to
of,
be fair.
yeah, for the sake of like trends and patterns, I think it's fine. But that varies a lot, population to population, as it
Mm,
turns out. If you're curious about this sort of thing, there's a guy named Dr. David Buss who is a pretty rigorous evolutionary psychologist, and there's a whole field of evolutionary biology. Now, and granted, like the field of evolutionary psychology is somewhat rife with those just so stories where the researcher who has the better story kind of wins. You know, if we like sort of retroactively ascribe, oh, because this behavior makes a lot of sense in the context of this sort of evolutionary condition. Okay, great. That's why we behave this way. And I don't think it's particularly good science in a lot of cases, but Dr. Buss's research is quite rigorous in most of the dimensions. I think his book on why women have sex, quote unquote, is a bit silly in terms of like external validity, considering it was like all undergraduate psychology students in the US. It's like, okay, I think generalizing to the world's population about why women have sex based on that cohort is maybe a bit silly. But regardless, you know, there are tribes in Africa that are you know, matriarchal, and there are gradations within women's preferences on like post-secondary sexual characteristics. So, for example, the lower socioeconomic status, the higher the rates of violence and economic instability, the more women have a preference on the average for men with square jaws and broad shoulders and profound musculature and facial hair and brow ridges and those sorts of things. So like the more educated, the more first world, the higher the socioeconomic status, the less things like how jacked the guy is and how, you know, tan and square jawed the guy is matter. So in a perhaps oversimplification of things, being masculine, quote unquote, in like traditional gender roles only matters when we're in more primitive, uncivilized environments, is how the reasoning goes. That's not my claim. That's just kind of a direction of the data that you could interpret that I think is a reasonable interpretation to think about. But so in terms of like, you know, do I think they want to jump on the roller coaster and jump on the ship and like let things steer? Like I said, I think that's a spectrum of authoritarianism. I think there's nothing wrong with having that proclivity. If you want a more polarized, you know, relationship with more traditional gender roles, I think that's fine. Do I think that's probably the majority of women? Yeah. Do I think there are tons of relationships where the guy is the one that is a bit more neurotic, a bit more all over the place, you know, more creative, more emotional, and the woman is the one that's holding down the fort, that's logical, that's stable, she's the rock? Absolutely. There's tons of relationships like that, and I think they work fine. So I don't know. That's my take on things, I guess.
I like it, man. Yeah. Honestly, as we veer off of entrepreneurship and into the weeds, I
Hey, getting a great relationship has very high ROI in entrepreneurship.
totally.
So understanding these things, I think, is you know, it's a business investment at the end of the day.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I might be butchering this, but I'm pretty sure that there was a Harvard study that showed that 90% of the quality of our lives is dictated by the quality of our relationships. And that rang pretty true for me. You also hear all these like sweet old people and viral YouTube shorts where they're like, what's like one piece of life advice? They're like, pick the right partner, you know? So,
Yeah, well, it's funny. So there's a lot of literature on this that, like, if you look at arranged marriages, it's funny. You would think like if you're forced to marry somebody, like that's not going to be a great marriage. But in India, I mean, oddly enough, and granted, you can make the argument that okay, they only have a higher percentage of quote unquote successful marriages that don't end in divorce because their familial units are so close knit and socially pressured that if you tried to divorce, you would be disavowed, disowned, exiled.
that's
You could
rough.
make that argument. I'm sure. I'm sure the researchers have probably tried to control for that as a confounding variable. But even if you discard those and you look at like, okay, among the people who got married for quote unquote love versus the people that got married because they shared values, they shared similar financial rationale, frugalism, whatever. They shared similar directions in life. similar socioeconomic backgrounds, similar levels of education, similar religion, similar philosophies on raising children. You look at all of those things and they're much better predictors of whether the couple gets divorced than love.
Interesting. I want to, you're such a smart guy. And I was going to say, as we veer off the weeds or into the weeds, I just noticed I'm like, oh, wow, there's so many different things I want to talk to you about. I want to be conscious of your time too, so we can start to wind down. But I'm curious, someone as well read as you and as experienced as you in different fields of life, where do you see life heading? Like, are you optimistic about the future of humanity? And one thing I'll tack onto that as an interesting anecdote is, I'm really into this increasing phenomenon of UFO sightings or UAP sightings and things of that nature, and more legit people like the head of immunology at Stanford, I believe, and David Grush and people like that talking and legitimizing basically the "we're not alone" premise. I'm curious, kind of where you see life going, and maybe with a touch of interplay of what I just mentioned.
Yeah, so I will confess, when they had I believe it was in Mexico, there was the like legislative session where they brought out a an alien carcass, and and admittedly a like conspiracy minded subreddit. There were a lot of seemingly compelling statements about how this legitimized all of the theories about UFOs and aliens and those sorts of things. And
Mm-hmm.
as I dug deeper, every time there was ever like a new thing that seemed to make it look like, oh, this is going to be the time. Every time I dug deeper, it never was.
Mm.
That's not to say that there aren't. That's not to say they weren't buried. That's just to say that I personally can't um, draw any meaningful conclusions about the existence of extraterrestrials, aliens, whatever you want to call them, in our observable universe. I will say there's a fun theory. I shouldn't say fun. There's maybe a vaguely traumatic but also sort of interesting theory for why we haven't observed alien life. Have you ever heard of the dark forest theory?
Not by that name, at least.
Okay,
Do
so
tell.
there's a great video. I didn't find this video until later, but if I did, it probably would have been one of my favorite things ever. There's a great video by probably butchering how you pronounce it, but Kurzgesagt on
Mm.
YouTube, on this theory, and basically the theory goes: you blast out your radio waves to the cosmos, and you hear nothing back until finally you get a return message that says, "Be quiet, they'll hear us."
Oh god.
And it's like the reason that we don't get any communication from any of the other extraterrestrial civilizations is because there is a predator civilization that anytime somebody becomes sophisticated enough that they are putting out probes, they can become detectable, they hunt them down and systematically eradicate them. And so the people that do exist are being quiet for that purpose. That functionally, if you were a society that wanted to put feelers out, you would be detected. So the only surviving ones are the ones that want to be quiet as a civilization. It's an interesting theory.
Have you gone down this rabbit hole, for lack of a better term, of like researching the more legit researchers or sober researchers on this topic and going down the rabbit hole?
I mean, I wouldn't say I've like exhaustively overviewed all of the literature, because to be honest, I haven't seen anything to make me think like, okay, this is worth digging deeper than like the cursory examinations I've done, which didn't turn anything up. I was like, okay, I don't really see there's a point in digging deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say I won't at some point. It's just not something I'm particularly interested in right now. But in
Sure.
terms of like your earlier question of like, where's life going? I mean, AI is getting pretty weird, man. It's getting pretty weird. It's
Yeah.
getting weird fast.
Yeah.
I mean, it's odd because it's hard to distinguish a lot of the PR aspects to it. Like, I think there was a recent news article from Tyler Perry that was like, oh yeah, I'm like halting expansion of our facility because a bunch of production and TV and animation jobs are going to be gone. It's like, okay, yeah, but that came on the wings of like Atlanta funding changes, and also like his latest ventures hadn't been particularly successful, and so maybe that was like a thinly veiled attempt at explaining away why they weren't doing so great. But at the same time, you can't fake the fact that like all of Hollywood went on strike for God knows how long, and you are seeing layoffs. And personally, I think the theory of, okay, well, when we made more robots that replaced manual labor jobs, like we created new jobs to replace those. I think taking that blanket approach with no nuance, just being like, oh, okay, new technology that replaces jobs always creates new jobs in equal form. It's like, that's a pretty suspect argument to me. I don't think in any meaningful sense that's a valid, cogent, sound argument based on at least what we've seen from current trends on like job replacement rates. And also, like, I think you have to be realistic about human capabilities. Like, we are biologically constrained. Our brains are already very optimized from a physiological standpoint. Like, they say we only use 10% or 33% or whatever of our brain. And it's like, yeah, in the same sense that you use a third of a stoplight at a time. It's like, if you used all of it, that's a seizure. Right? It's like, you don't want to be using all of it all the time. It's like, that's, you go drop some mushrooms, you'll be closer. That's like, you look at a brain on psychedelics, and it's like all the pathways are connected. There's tons of activity. It's like, yeah, you want to use closer to 100%, go trip on shrooms. Like, that's
Yeah.
not it's not an optimal existence in terms of cognition for like everyday tasks, right? There's a reason you don't. So in that sense, like, they're like, okay, well, truckers are getting replaced by autonomous vehicles. God knows when Elon will ever, successfully do that. But I think it's only a matter of time, because we have eyes that are less effective than cameras. We don't have LiDAR to see through fog, right? We don't have, scanners on all sides, right? So I think it's kind of silly to believe that cars couldn't drive better than people, and I think that's what the data already shows. And so, yeah, truckers are going to get replaced, and then the logic goes like, okay, we'll just teach them to code. It's like, all right. I don't know if you ever like worked with truckers, but I worked with a couple trucking startups, and those guys are not generally the types of dudes that I would think would ever go and learn Python. I don't think
Yeah.
they want to. I don't think they care to. Nor do I think everybody has the capability to be a software developer. And
Yeah.
so, like, okay, that's a far cry from machine learning engineer. I don't know if you ever tried to study deep learning from like MIT's OpenCourseWare, but it's not simple stuff. So I don't think that the vast majority of the population could do that stuff. So even if you did create new jobs, what would they be? If you replaced, if you arm one guy with super Photoshop that's like AI, that you just go like, okay, take this library, here's all the instructions for 100 people, go implement, and you just supervise, and you go, okay, this one was a little off, tweak it this way, this one was a little off, tweak it this way. It's like, cool, you just did 100 dudes Photoshop jobs. So it's like, okay, doesn't take a rocket science to do the math there on how that goes. So yeah, I don't know. In terms of like where things are going, the fact that Zuckerberg is building a bunker in Hawaii with like 400
Yeah.
zillion acres,
Yeah.
Sam Altman has a bunker, and I think most of the backroom talks with like entrepreneurs I know who are in like lobbying and Wall Street and in DC, it's like there's a lot of backroom talks about UBI right now, and I think that's probably to a certain extent inevitable. And like, it may be we end up in this like post scarcity world where you are not ever at want for your basic necessities. And like, the fact is we have enough housing for people, and it's food scarcity is more of a distribution problem than a production problem. So like, I think that is also solvable. I think there's enough technology to give everybody drinkable water. So like I'm optimistic in terms of like net suffering globally over the next 100 years, but I don't think anybody really knows. I mean, obviously nobody's a seer, but yeah, I could go on that for a decade. But
Yeah. No, I like that. So, okay. Do you think we're going to merge with the AI eventually? Is that inevitable, or do you think we're going to find a way to kind of retain our organicness?
I find it more plausible that AI succeeds us as a species than that we merge with it to create like the ultimate superorganism.
Mm,
I just think that biology and synthetic life are somewhat incompatible. Like
mm,
it's yeah, you can be Neuralink and like get a brain chip interface, but I don't. And maybe this is me just not being a world expert in nanotechnology and neuroscience, but to me, like some of the work Mellanox did with interfacing like high speed networking between like GPU servers and stuff, which is one of the reasons NVIDIA acquired them, makes it significantly more plausible to me that you could have a lot of individual autonomous AI agents that all can communicate with each other infinitely faster than humans can communicate with each other. Like, barring brain brain interface, I think the beauty of humanity is that we can specialize and you can make the chairs for me to sit on, but I can then make the food. And so, net on net, like we make more food and more chairs. It's like the beauty of humanity that we can divide and conquer. When you are what we see now in like the PhD, among all the dissertations that come out over time, you have more and more specialized PhD dissertations. And what that means is that the low-hanging fruit for generalists is disappearing, because if you've got 8 billion people all thinking about smart stuff, or at least a subset of them thinking about smart stuff, the stuff that's easy to figure out that you can get without going deep into things diminishes pretty rapidly. And that's not to say there's not shallow stuff. Like, we didn't invent wheels on luggage till like the 70s. We had a guy on the moon and an atom bomb before we figured out to go like, oh, we can roll this thing, right? So like that's not to say there's not low hanging fruit, but just it's a diminishing commodity. So and unfortunately, it's hard for the guy that's the neuroscience PhD to convey everything he knows to the guy that's the robotics PhD, so that they can make a robot that operates on brains optimally, right? Like that's it's a difficult thing for them to collaborate optimally. Whereas if you've got an AI that knows the entirety of robotics history and textbooks, and one that knows all of neuroscience in one unit, that can communicate all of that data at the speed of terabytes per second. Um, I mean, that's a pretty massive delta in the amount that they're able to communicate with each other. So
mhm.
I just think that as a collective is able to move things much faster than individual biological organisms. And so, um, on the hand of like, you can't communicate artificial to natural, and then artificial is much faster communicating than we are. That to me seems like the most plausible justification for why they'll probably succeed us. But I also don't know like what the unit economics of energy consumption are as we scale this thing up. Like, we've got massive data centers for this stuff, and I don't know where the limit on, like we thought for a long time, okay, CPUs, we're getting into like quantum tunneling where the electrons are jumping through the silicon because we're trying to get these things below 7 nanometers or whatever the number was. And then, they came up with another way around that. And so, and then they're like, okay, well, now we can scale up the number of cores. And, NVIDIA ran into the problem where you've got 8 quadrants. If one of them fails, the card is useless. And they're like, well, okay, let's just like quadrant it off, or let's just coordinate off. And then we have 7 usable quadrants. And so we can output cards that way. And so like, there's all this innovation going on that is continuing in spite of seemingly the laws of physics constraining our ability to continue getting better compute. And so I don't know where that road ends. I don't think anybody knows where that road ends. And I don't know how our ability to scale up AI capabilities, compute capabilities, like there's software, there's hardware, and then there's like, well, to not get into that, but so I mean, I think the foreseeable future will keep improving. Like that's a pretty straight line up for the last few years. But yeah, I don't. That's my admittedly ignorant take on things that are far above my understanding as a not machine learning engineer.
I love the admitted ignorance in the face of just like you're like if it's within 7 nanometers of the you're just like so intellectually it seems well read on like everything we've talked about, which is pretty incredible. And bro, I want to be conscious of your time
Of
once
course,
again,
yeah,
so I want to ask you maybe one or two just little fun lightning round questions that I
sure.
stole from Andre and Christian from their old podcast.
Yeah.
The main one that I loved that I kind of tweaked is if you had a 15-second State of the Union address that was going to be seen by every single person in the world, and you knew that whatever message you shared, everyone would ponder deeply and take to heart, what what would you say?
Oh man, that's a really tough question.
I know. Sorry to put you on the
Um,
spot.
I mean, I would probably the fact that Russia is like obviously running active disinformation in the U.S. and like it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at those troll farms and see like what angles they're trying to spin. I'd say more than anything to get outside of your bubble because you're in a bubble whether you know it or not, and the more you can try and consume diverse news sources and sources of information to become educated and try to find like if you can't even entertain the possibility that you're wrong about one of your opinions about things like climate change or gun control or right left, AI control, things like that, I can assure you that 99.9% of the population does not have a full understanding of whatever issue you're taking a hard stance on. And that's just the unfortunate reality. Like every single one of these issues is insanely nuanced and complex. And so, unless you've been studying it for 5 years, you probably don't even know how pathetically little you know about the topic. So, like, try and broaden your horizons, try and find other sources of information. Don't, if you're just on Twitter, you're going to get a very slanted thing. If you're just on Reddit, you're going to get a very left slanted thing. So that's probably the thing I would say that's like a meta advice that touches every other underlying issue that I find are most of the time it's just a matter of ignorance and people like taking a hard stance on things they don't understand.
I love that. Kind of boils down to just keep an open mind and don't get locked into your own echo chamber, essentially. Well, I appreciate that. If anyone listening is interested in connecting more with you or maybe even working with you, where would you direct them?
Yeah, I'm kind of a behind the scenes guy these days.
Yeah.
So I'm not active on Twitter. I don't really post on LinkedIn. I for a while thought I would be a public brand guy and just realized I have very minimal interest in doing so. But if you were to connect with me, I'd say the best bet is probably LinkedIn. LinkedIn.com/in/Jeremy Schaller, spelled Schaller.
Cool. I'll have that link in the description and anything else that you want in there. And yeah, thank you, brother. I appreciate your time.
Cheers.